Great. Good morning, everybody. It's MaggieBot here with Nicholas Co. Hi, Nicholas.
Hello, everyone.
I'm glad to see you this morning. Our intention today was to do a little bit about feedback and playtesting and just kind of how that works and what works well and what makes a fun feedback environment and playtesting environment and what doesn't, and some pitfalls that I see a lot of people do. And I know that Nicholas has playtested a lot of games, especially some of the heavier games, and kind of done rule books and stuff. And that gives you kind of a unique perspective because I don't think a lot of people have that. But I figure first we could probably just talk a little bit about games we've played lately, just as a warm up, because that seems to be the thing. Have you played anything recently that you really liked?
Well, I had a lovely time last weekend at Dice Tower Con. I played. I finally got around to trying Indonesia, and it's wonderful. It strangely reminds me a lot of other auction-focused games. I keep thinking of Chicago Express because I've been thinking about that a lot lately since I was working on the video. But yeah, that was a ton of fun. And then I also taught a bunch of people 18xx with a combination of 1857, 1889 last weekend. So I got in like 5 plays of 18xx, which is a lot for one weekend.
That's mind-blowing to me. Like, that's crazy. Have you ever played so many so quickly?
No, the closest thing was at HeavyCon where I played I just played one a day, and a lot of those were also a lot longer. So I had multiple games that lasted at HeavyCon for 6+ hours. The ones I was teaching were of course chosen to be short. And so they played at about 4 hours with another 30 minutes or so of instruction. So playing 2 of those back to back was not so hard as a lot of other things I could have done. But yeah.
Well, I like using cons as an excuse to play those games that you just don't get to schedule that often. Maybe you get an 18xx game in here or there, maybe on a weekend, but never like 6 in a whole weekend. And the amount of thinking you can do about your moves and like best plays and stuff like that, it's completely unique when you play them that quick together in quick succession.
Yeah, I was also super happy that I got to play 3. I was especially happy to get to play Indonesia 3 times in rapid succession because it really helped the game unfold for me. Whereas, I think it would have taken me another couple plays to get to where I am now with the game if I'd played them spaced further apart.
Yeah, and I definitely think there's a good spacing. Like 2 weeks is an okay spacing, but as soon as you get beyond 3 or 4 weeks, you're gonna basically be kind of poking around at the thing again and not really having a cohesive plan of what's going to work best.
Yeah, I've been trying to play Terra Mystica more recently because I played it a few times before and I've loved it, but they've been 3 months apart. And at that point, it's just oh, right, this is how the game works again, which is not as fun.
Yeah, we almost ended up, so I met a friend playing Pokemon Go yesterday, and we brought him back to play games with us, and we played Orleans and La Granja, but we almost busted out Terra Mystica because, if anything's going to really hook you on a Euro game, if that's, a thing for you, that game's going to do it.
I do love me some Terra Mystica.
So much fun. I got to play the big thing. I played Scythe the other day. Some guys randomly came into the shop on the game night, or on the night that I usually play games over there, and they didn't really know anyone, and they said they had been carrying around this deluxe copy of Scythe, which is pretty darn heavy, for days, and could not find people to play it with. So I was like, okay, yeah, teach me the game, whatever. And so Scythe is this big crazy game from Stonemaier, and it's got some elements that you'd be familiar with from them. A lot of it feels like a Stonemaier game with just the way the rules are laid out and the different things you can do and the asymmetrical powers and stuff like that. But you basically are putting out these giant mechs and doing this thing, and it looks like a combat game, but it's very much not a combat-based game. It's much more of just an engine builder, and territory that you take over is going to kind of deem what you can do on a turn, and so just positioning is really important. I did pretty well in it, so I don't know if it was just beginner's luck or if the game felt a little less balanced because of the player power type randomization. Like your abilities are kind of randomized together, and it's a little. I don't know. I felt like it wasn't super well balanced that way. Like you didn't get any suggestions or anything for how to set that up. Did you get to play Scythe?
Yes, I tried Scythe at Dice Tower Con actually, and that was interesting. It was one of those things where I sat down at the table and I thought that the people who had the game knew how to play, but apparently they didn't really. And so it was one of those like, oh, and that's a rule several moves into the game.
Oh, no.
So I made some really bad choices earlier, not knowing how movement actually worked. Uh, that was less than great, but yeah, it's interesting.
So I talked to another friend of mine who was in on the same evening in a game of it elsewhere in town, and so we both have pretty much decided that we'd like to play against each other and give some feedback because he's definitely the person I go to if I feel like I really want to challenge or if the game is a certain kind of game, I'll just get killed by him. But like if I really want to see what a game is all about and I want to pick it apart, he's the one I go to. So I'm pretty excited to see what the game would be like that way. I'm not convinced that it's my kind of game. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty convinced that's not my time of game. I was rereading the rule. I was reading the rules, not rereading them. I didn't get to read them before or during the game. Someone else had the rule book, so I was reading them after to see like how much of what I experienced was like they just told me things that were wildly incorrect, which happens. And they got the game mostly right eventually, and and I got to the part of the rules where they're like, you're not allowed to calculate scores, or that's not quite what they say. They say that they intentionally made calculating scores more difficult, which I don't think it's actually hard, but anyway. And then they're like,
No.
and if you slow the game down by more than 10 seconds, then you'll be punished for it, for calculating scores. I was like, wow, this is apparently not meant for me. I'll calculate anyway. Thank you.
So on one side of the board, there's these there's a certain amount of popularity, and you get that through workers and stuff. And the higher your popularity, the more things are worth. So territory you control and stuff you have, all worth more points the more popular in the game you are, which is just kind of workers placed out on the board. And it's not that hard to calculate a score. It's gonna take more than 10 seconds, but it's not that hard, and it's easy to see who's doing well and who's not.
Yeah, it's a game where like you can calculate someone's score and then their score doesn't change that much turn to turn. So it's very easy to keep it up to date like as you're playing. Like if you need to stop and recalculate everything, then that will take you a bit. But yeah.
I just think there is an element inside the gamerdom that they think that if you can tell that you're losing a game, you'll stop playing. And that might be true, but in my case, if I'm spending a lot of time playing a game, I'd like to see my progression versus others. And if it's got any kind of combat or any kind of things I can do negatively against other players, I want to know who best to target based on who's doing well. And I find it ridiculous that they would take that away from me. Don't take that away from me in a combat game.
Yeah, it was really surprising to me when I read that because the factions are pretty asymmetric, and then depending on the random setup at the start of the game, I think that can be magnified significantly. And so knowing who's doing well and therefore who to target with attack for your few attacks of the game, because realistically you're not going to be attacking all that much, seems really important.
That's probably true. So the other thing I got to play, let's see. I didn't play that much the last couple weeks. I did get to play some games of Magic, which was nice, but I have been kind of laying low, got some turmoil at home. So did you get to play anything else other than your 1,000,018xx games?
Yeah, I got to try Costa Rica, which seems like a fine push your luck game. It's not really my thing. I do like that has a so in Costa Rica, like you're flipping tiles to press your luck rather than flipping a deck of cards. And I like the spatial aspect of the tile. It's still a push your luck game though, so I don't get much out of those personally. I also tried Timeline last night, which I haven't played before. It's not like it's something that is more of a social activity, I think, than a game per se. Like it has rules and there is a goal to play all your cards, but really it's just like place these things in order, which is fine. I revisit Guillotine, which is interesting because I haven't played that game in probably 7 years or so.
Oh my.
And it's always fascinating to go back and look at games I haven't played in forever. And that was back when I was like first starting to get into playing board games regularly. Yeah.
I did that recently. The new Raw came out, and so I bought the new one, Fantasy Flight or Wind Rider Games or whatever. The Fantasy Flight that's not Fantasy Flight now. They put out a $60 like medium box version of Raw, and it's exactly the same. I couldn't tell any gameplay differences. It just had like slight component differences. But that was one I played at meetups when I was like brand new to gaming, had zero games of my own, and I was just kind of relying on other people to tell me what to play. And it's just a very pure auction game, which is kind of neat, but very luck heavy. I was surprised at how warm and fuzzy in my mind Raw was when, wow, there's a lot of luck in that game.
Yep, definitely. And it's it's one of my favorite auction games, but it is pretty luck heavy, and I mostly forgive it for that because it's so short. Nowadays, there are other games that I'd rather play that have auctions in them, but are not just auction games. Yeah. What is that? I forgot the other thing I was going to say about it.
The one thing I will say, it included an embossed board, so like all of the pretty hieroglyphics and stuff was like embossed along the front, and I was like, oh, okay, if this is going to be the new trend in games, I'm for that, because it was really a cool use of cardboard, because very few other, things could be embossed that easily with just like a quick stamp of stuff. Mm-hmm. Amun-Re. So Ori is asking about that one, which I think they're redoing Amun-Re as well this year. Which was another one I played very early on, and last year I replayed it and thought, wow, this is very clever, very well done, but really, really luck heavy. Like, I think as I was learning games, like, no, you don't realize how that's going to affect you until later when you have kind of what you like picked out, and randomness is just so not okay that in that amount.
Yes, yeah. Randomness can be fun. Like I still enjoy seasons a good amount, but that's also because I played it a lot online where there's no setup time and there were always people, and so I could knock out a game of that in 20 minutes or so, which is a place where I'm okay with lots of random.
I like some random games. Race for the Galaxy is pretty good example of like a random game that I really enjoy, because that's incredibly draw dependent, but there's lots of ways of mitigating it, stuff like that, but it is pretty, you have to at least draw a couple cards that work together in the beginning, or else you just get behind. But it's fast too. It's like a half-hour long game, so I guess that does come into account.
Right. I don't mind so much losing to like, oh, you got a lucky draw, or oh, I didn't get my engine running in the first few rounds, so I'm not winning. But as long as the game is short enough, I think that's fine. With longer games, I think it's more important to feel like you at least have a chance.
So let's talk a little bit about playtesting long games, because I think you have more experience in that than most people I know, except for like Paul and Cow and developers and things like that. But playtesting long games for me has always been kind of a challenge. You're putting a lot more literal time at the table into a game that's not maybe as balanced as it would be if it was out at retail, and you go into it knowing that, so you have to have a whole different mental state about it. And so a lot of what you're thinking about is not necessarily how to win the game, but as you're playing, trying to come up with useful feedback and things that are going to improve the game. Have you found that you still enjoy playtesting long games? I know you've been kind of in a 6-month Lisboa crunch at this point.
Yeah, I've playtested Lisboa 5 times now, I think. I finally lost the game, which is nice. I always get really worried, especially when I'm playtesting and I keep winning. Like, winning all the time is always boring. Like, I went to be challenged and do new and interesting things. Well, I guess winning in the same way is the problem. Yeah, or roughly the same way. Like if I win and it's because someone did something unexpected or I found something new to do, then that's still fun and enjoyable. But if it's just pushing the same button repeatedly, that's less cool.
Right, but you kind of want to, like your second game, you kind of want to repeat what you did to see if other people can find a way around it. Because it's interesting when you're like, okay, this just crushed you guys last time. Let's try it again and see if like you can prevent me from doing it again. But if they can't,
yeah, that's always a bad sign. Ori is asking about. Well, he mentioned that the playtime is about 5 hours on Lisboa online, and it's always been, or I should say that Vital always tells me that's much shorter in person. But the online playtests are slow because of the system that we're using, Tabletopia. You have to like pick up and move all the pieces with a mouse and move the camera around and stuff, and that gets a little tedious. The game recently got a lot shorter, actually down to, I think my last playtest took only 3 hours, which is a big decrease from 5. In terms of how I deal with playtesting sessions that long, I usually end up ordering a meal sometime in there, which always helps. My first time playtesting Lisboa, I did not expect it to run for 5 hours, and so I had it prepared to get food during the playtest, and that always hurts. In terms of, like, another thing is that when you're playtesting the same game repeatedly, you're playtesting it with different tweaks. So Lisboa has undergone a bunch of changes, some of them much larger than others. Certainly the most recent one that I tried is very different in terms of how it plays out, even though a lot of the concepts are the same. I don't really mind rules changing. When I'm playtesting a game, I'm not playing it in the same way that I play it when I'm playing for fun. Like, in some ways, I don't know what is fun when I'm playtesting. I generally am not the best person to ask about if you're looking for a fun, quote unquote, game. Like, I enjoy games, but I enjoy challenging games. Yeah.
I find, especially like being around you, I will want to play heavier games because they are more fun to play with you than playing with a person that's maybe played one of them once. I think heavy games are just like any other hobby. Like, the more you play of them, the better you are at them, and the better you are for like creating a fun environment. Because as soon as you get past the mechanics a little bit, you get to have the other like personality based fun. Playtesting, though, I find brings out some really odd parts of people. There are a lot of people that want to win games, and if they're not winning, it's not as good of a time for them. And so playtesting, like as you said, there's a lot of times where you find that one button to push that wasn't maybe playtested yet, and you start winning or crushing, and everyone else at the table deflates because you found that one thing. But that's kind of the reason you're there. So everyone has to like just hang in and try and get to the end of the game. I have found the longer the game, I haven't had a good time playtesting longer games yet.
I've been very lucky to get to playtest with Vital because, like, he's done this a few times now. So I think he's better at it than newer designers. Like, designing a new game is hard. Like, designing your first game is hard, or your first few games. And designing a long game is particularly difficult. And one of the main things I see go wrong in my playtests of longer stuff has been that a new designer will decide to make like a big long game, and they have all this stuff in it. And sometimes it's useful to just take parts of it and playtest that and see if it like works as a mechanism, or like to do the opening or the mid game or something like that.
Like, we have this auction mechanic, and we want to see how it plays over several like turns or something, and see if it actually adds into the game before you add the other bits to it.
Right. And I think it's really important to be willing to call playtests or even just change rules on the fly, because there's no point in continuing to playtest something, particularly if it's hours long, that, is just clearly broken, and not necessarily broken in terms of balance, but broken in terms of like a good gameplay experience, whatever that means for your game. And of course, the experience that you're going for will differ a lot.
Well, so playtesting in front of the game designer is very a different experience. You have to remember like the number of sleepless nights and hours and stuff that people have gone through to get that game to that point. It's so much easier when the designer can step out a little bit so that like I can remember there was a Playtest Northwest event, which is like a big playtest company around here, and I was playtesting a card game, a pretty simple, fun time travel card game. And 3 turns in, I start saying, oh, okay, so if I do this and this and this, there's no way you can take another action for like 4 rounds or something. I just started like pulling apart a particular mechanic and starting like out loud to try and speak about how that might be fixed. And unfortunately, the designer heard like the tail end of my gripe about it and like zooms over the table and starts like talking about why that mechanic is the way it is and how it works in the theme and like blah 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 blah. And as soon as he kind of wandered away again a few rounds later, everyone else at the table was like, yeah, you're right, like that you completely negated my turns for a few rounds. And I wish there was a way to politely tell a designer that they're being overbearing and not allowing kind of a creative process to happen on their game. But
Yeah.
you've been working very directly with Vital, so I'm impressed that it can be as productive as all that.
I think so when I sit down at playtest, I try to remember to ask a few things. One of which is just generally, is there an audience that they're designing the game for, or at least like an experience that they're aiming for? A lot of times people don't know, and that means that I'm trying to figure out what they're aiming for as I'm playtesting it, which makes it that much harder. Like, I don't know if this is supposed to be goofy off the wall stuff, or it's supposed to be more contemplative strategy or something else. I don't know. And then the other thing is I try to ask about when they want their feedback. Because some people want feedback while you're playtesting, and other people want to discuss it afterward. I don't mind much either way. If it's a longer game, then I tend to take notes if it's give feedback after. And also during longer games, I tend to prefer giving feedback after, because during the game, it's involved enough that I'm just trying to understand what to do.
Well, and you kind of want to get through it. You don't want to slow down the process.
Right. Yeah, I'm much more open to discussing like hour-long games as I play them.
I've had a good amount of luck asking similar questions, like who's your audience, what kind of what, like, when do you want your feedback, but what kind of feedback is also a question I get into that question before I sit at the table. Like, if someone says, hey, you want to play test my game, I'll say, okay, well, where is it at? Is it just a rough sketch that you had on a napkin, or has it gone through some playtesting? Are you trying to tweak the cards at this point? Because I think as a playtester, my specialty is in kind of balance. So once a game is actually working and all the bits work well together and the game ends when it should, and like those types of things, I can start pulling apart, especially if you have like cards with powers on them or something like that. I'm very good at like picking out actions that are not worth it, or actions that are overpowered, and cards that are under or overpowered. I think everyone kind of falls into a where they're good category, and I'm not so great at the like actual, I think you should design this part into this game, because it's just not my wheelhouse.
Yeah, it's important to understand that there are different kinds of playtesting, and there are different playtesters who are better and not so great at the different types of playtesting. Like, I know that I'm not good at telling people whether or not like a mechanism is fun or enjoyable. I can tell you, like, is it interesting to maneuver around? So if you're aiming for like a challenge type experience, particularly with strategy or planning for several rounds, and I'm very comfortable playtesting that. There's a lot of other stuff that I'm less comfortable playtesting, and I've started to be a little bit pickier about what groups I playtest with and what events I playtest at. Like, do I know the person? Stuff like that. Like I've come to like Unpub a little bit less. Like, Unpub is a great event with tons of playtest opportunities, but because it's open to the public and free, and there's just so many people, it tends to be more less people who like playtest a lot and more like you're playtesting your final experience at that point of like, I think this game is more or less done. Or at least it's the types of playtests that seem most productive to me in that environment. Whereas when I go to Metatopia, that is almost entirely designers testing other designers' games. And that's a very different feel.
Yeah, I think we both have gotten to the point where we can be more picky and just, oh, I'm sorry, like that project doesn't feel like it's either going to be a good experience for me or that I'm going to be that helpful, or it's not in the place that I would like to playtest it. There's also mediums. So you've been playtesting over Tabletopia, whereas I've been completely uncomfortable trying to playtest something online. Did you have an okay experience like learning Lisboa that way, or did you play something before that?
I was so playtesting Lisboa was the first time that I used Tabletopia at all. So I was both learning the platform and the game at the same time, and that's always really rough. And that's true of like any online play system, I think. One of the upsides, I think, of Tabletopia for playtesting is that the game itself doesn't have an interface. It is that you're just picking up the pieces. And that means that you're not like learning, like you can learn the Tabletopia interface and use that to play lots of things versus like trying to figure out like, how do I look at my hand in this particular implementation and stuff like that. I definitely prefer playtesting in person, and I'm really only willing to playtest online with people who I at least know what their work is like, I guess you could say, or I know them personally or whatever. It's not something, if someone posted on Twitter, I don't really know them and was like, come playtest my game on Tabletopia, I'd be much more hesitant about that.
Well, so the majority of what I get personally, just like the MaggieBot thing, I get a lot of people wanting me to preview games that are going to Kickstarter. And here's where I think playtesting and feedback could be really helpful if more creators realize that was a good time for it. A lot, and I'm talking 90% of the time, when someone wants to send you a preview game for a Kickstarter that's not live yet, hasn't gone to like the production or anything, but they are at that point not willing to change anything about their game. And I almost find it to be where I'm less willing to do a Kickstarter preview if the game maker thinks their game is done. Because you have an opportunity, right? Before you've actually sent files to wherever the game is getting produced, you have an opportunity to improve on that game one more time before you have to do a second edition or a second version, which I think is ridiculous for Kickstarter games. So I think getting it right the first time is super important. And I think when someone wants you to preview a Kickstarter, it actually speaks better to me in my mind if they're willing to get some feedback before it actually goes live or even while it's live. Because I know how this works. I know that at some point you send the files to the manufacturer and you say go, but I also know that there's supposed to be some time in between when your Kickstarter actually funds and when you push that button. So I really appreciate some of the game makers that are willing to take some feedback and maybe change things before they get too far. Have you had to do any Kickstarter previews or anything?
Not really, no. I think it's very, very important to be willing to take feedback on a game, at least up until you actually push the print button. I've worked on a number of games where like we thought it was near completion, and at some point we realized that it's not actually coming together. Like we keep twiddling the numbers and it's just not working, and then the designer takes it and revamps it, or maybe they just shelve it entirely, because that's also a totally valid thing to do with your designs, right? So like Lisboa was one of these games where it seemed to be pretty close to completion, but there were some problems with like the way that the end game was playing out and stuff. And Vital had tried a few different ideas and eventually took it and just revamped like the game structure pretty significantly in private, more or less, and then brought it back out to public playtesting, which I think was a really good thing to do.
Yeah, and there's a moment where I don't want to pick on this too much because I think he's a fabulous designer and his games are really great, but when Oh My Goods had to get like kind of a second rules version when the game started going wide, it was available in Europe, but then it started getting more popular elsewhere, and almost immediately a whole different rules version, at least for me it felt like a whole different game, came out because there were so many problems with the game as it was printed. And to me that speaks to just maybe not enough playtesting, and like that could have been prevented, but it was done by a pretty big company. I think it was Lookout Spiel, right?
Yeah, it was Lookout.
And they should know better by that point, right?
I don't know. It's weird. Like Oh My Goods was interesting because it was initially designed as a charity game for the Austrian Games Museum. And so like the art is all entirely recycled and it's just a deck of cards because that's really cheap to print, and it was sold at a very low price point. And people started to enjoy it, or at least the concept of it, a lot. And I think Lookout latched onto that and decided to do a print run, which is a reasonable thing to do. But they hadn't really put it through development at all because it already sold a few hundred copies, I guess. I do wish that they'd taken the time to look at the game more closely before doing a larger print run, because I imagine they must have ordered it pretty much immediately because it was initially released at Spiel and then it was reprinted in Europe like maybe a month to 2 months later.
Yeah, I know that museum and those games are generally good, not great. There was like a Sherlock Dice one a couple years ago for the same museum, and I mean they're fun and it's a cool idea and the money's going to a good place. But for a wider print run or for something international, which Oh My Goods did, I wish they had taken a moment, like set up some time just to get a little more playtesting done, because it was very obvious by playing it that it was good, but not quite there. And there's nothing more frustrating to me than a game that has like a glimmer of really awesome and just a lot of extra stuff around it that you wish you could cut out. And the redo, like the new rules implementation that he did, where you could like toss your hand and kind of help with all that stuff, really made that game like 50% better.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm still trying to figure out sort of in the industry what people I like to work with, and also different publishers have different ways of engaging with designers, and different designers have different ways of engaging with other people. You know, so like sometimes, like I know that there are publishers who do playtesting and development in cooperation with the designer, or they just take the game and they do development more or less without the designer being involved too much. And then there are companies that just take the game and pretty much print it more or less as is. And it's helpful to know which one's which.
Well, and I think at this point you kind of know some companies really value developers and they're few and far between, which I think is sad. And there are developers and companies that don't, as soon as they have the game, they just squirrel it away and they don't talk to the designer anymore. They just go and make like decisions. And then the game comes out and everyone's, so at least in my world, you watch everyone going, "Hey designer, why is this way? And why is this way?" And he's like, "I don't know." Like after it left me, that just changed all the things and it used to be this way. And I find that to be more sad than anything else, because that designer gets discounted, but it's still his name on the box. Or you get companies that don't put any name on the box. Like the Fantasy Flight design group in general doesn't really give credit to the design because they just put it into that amorphous design team where Kanitska and Eric Lang have kind of transcended that a little bit, but there's still a lot of unnamed designers that are working on these games that you don't really get to talk to. But I wonder if Fantasy Flight had moved toward more of a give the designer credit and give developer credit, and developers becoming more of a name, if that would have been better, because then you could ask the developer why something was the way it was, because that's who probably did it.
Yeah, I actually watched this play out with Mombasa,
Oh,
where Alexander was like answering questions of the forums based on how he had designed the game. And then I forget the name of the developer would come in and say, no, it actually works like this now. And then Alexander would go and read the rule book and come back and say, yes, apparently this is now how it works, which is just always really awkward. I think part of it is that like as an industry, developers are not recognized, or at least not publicly recognized, I should say, at the very least. And so it's like sort of this weird shadow role where you spend a lot of time with a game and get relatively little credit for it.
but can you name more than 3 developers? Because I probably can't.
Like I know, yes, I can. Yeah. So yes,
Grogan.
mm-hmm.
Then I start running out.
Tom Lehman.
As a developer?
Yes, he does. Like Tom, I don't know. Like I haven't worked with him or even worked with a developer who's worked with him, but my understanding is that a lot of times he does. And there's a very blurry line a lot of the time between the design role and the development role. But Tom's definitely worked on a lot of games, is my understanding, that don't necessarily have his name on the box. The guy at Hall Games, I forget his name, embarrassingly.
Oh, I know who you're talking about now. I can't remember, but I do know who you're talking about. There is a very, very good developer at Hall Games.
Right. I mean, it's basically just him.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, Hall
Right.
Games, they put out money. Pegasus Spiel had a couple guys, I think, at one point, but have been rotating through them a little bit last couple of years.
Right. And then Rainer Stockhausen at DLP Games does development as a job.
Does he do a development on games he didn't design?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. In fact, like DLP published a number of games that were basically him developing them for a while. Like Citrus was like that. And Citrus is what actually got me really interested in Stockhausen because I'm spacing on the name of the designer. Anyway, the designer said that like when they delivered Citrus to Rainer, it was like a very different game than it is now, and I really like Citrus quite a lot for what it is. But I've also I'm very aware of developers because I've spent a lot of time researching them and following them. Like I will intentionally play a range of games from that I know that the same developer has worked on, and I can start to pick out their touches versus the designer's touches.
I really like that, the familiarity, because I think designer, developer, and artist credit should be on the box. I think designer credit is on a lot of boxes already, and that's really important because they do have the genesis of the game. But developers and artists especially can bring that game out and make it what it is in the final version. And I don't think a lot of designers are the 0 to 100. I think they use other people along the way, and those people deserve some credit. And that way you can start learning their names and kind of following their career too. And they also might get paid, which would be lovely if developers got paid more often. I do think it's one of those unpaid game positions that just exists.
Right. And there's a lot of unpaid labor right now in the board game industry. I've seen several discussions about like should playtesters get paid, and I don't know, and I think a lot of that comes down to the type of playtesting. But briefly, like if there are people who are just sort of like pounding on the game and it's not fun for them, but they're working on it to help make a better game, I think those people pretty clearly should be compensated in some fashion. I don't know if that's monetary or whatever. And then there are people who just come and try the game, and those people are valuable too. But maybe they don't work on it as much. I don't know what the answer is there.
Yeah, I think games as it is just, it's kind of in its infancy, and there will be more paid positions eventually. It's so small. Like the margins are still so small, and no one's really getting paid. There's so few people actually making their money on games that I won't worry about it now. I'll worry about it in 10 years when some big conglomerate owns half of us, Asmodee, and then if people aren't getting paid, I'll be upset. But
right. I mind a lot less about not getting paid when no one's getting paid. Like I know a lot of publishers that are basically just run in the evening, and a lot of designers who work just in the evening. I guess I've also been thinking about compensation because I think it's really important for representation in games. Like right now, games are going to be designed by people who are affluent or relatively affluent anyway, in the sense that they have a job that they only work at for 40 hours, and then they can go and do other stuff, and they have the money to go to conventions and pitch their games and stuff like that.
I mean, making a game is very costly. It's costly for me to just be a fan of games. Like if I want to play and know the new games, it's a lot of money. It's a great percentage of my income goes just to games, and especially game conventions, any type of travel for that. So there's definitely a class line of people that can afford to do game development and get a game out into the greater public and go and make sure it sells and get it to a good publisher, and those that can't, and those that don't have that resource. And it sucks that still exists, but it's gonna be prevalent for a while unless we specifically go and try and break that down a little bit. There's just no money in games.
Right. It's unpaid work right now, and for a lot of people, it's like unpaid. Well, like they love making games, and that's great. I'm happy that they get to do that. I wish that more people could both love games and get paid for them.
Oh, that's the dream.
It really is.
I liked Netter's plays. Had a pretty interesting set of questions. She's been playtesting more often. Do you find yourself seeking certain publishers to playtest, or do they seek you? And how do you give them feedback? Email, video, hangout, in person, like different ways. Do you have an answer?
So I don't really work with publishers much so far. I do some playtesting a lot more rarely than I'd like with the NYC playtesting group. They meet at least twice a month usually. So I work with them a lot. There are publishers who I'd be willing to playtest for, but I prefer to playtest locally, like in person, because it's just so much easier to work with, and I don't have to, like if you're playtesting remotely, sometimes people will actually just send you a copy of a prototype, but a lot of times my understanding is that they just give you print and play files, and then it's like I have to chop up all the cards and stuff. And at the moment, there aren't that many people I want.
Playtesting is like the worst thing that's ever happened. Anytime someone wants to send you files, like it's your time and effort and money to print that stuff out, make sure it's playable, like the bits are playable and sleeves or whatever, and it's still not a full game. I hate print and plays.
I'm okay with print and plays as a way to get more playtesting than perhaps you can afford to otherwise. Like you just can't make that many copies of the game, and you can't get to that many conventions and stuff. And I think it's particularly useful for blind playtesting, where you want people to try the rulebook and come back and tell you about the game. Although blind playtesting is also particularly tricky, both for the people doing the playtesting and for the designer, as they tried to figure out what game was actually played and communicate that.
Oh, that's the best part is like, oh, we played this and this and this happened, and they're like, no, none of that is possible. How did you get there?
Right. I watched Gil recently try to do a blind play test of his rule book for the networks, and that was an interesting experience. Because he basically was at a convention and the group was willing to actually just sit there with the draft rule book and try to learn from it and play it. And then he had to sit there off to the side and try to not comment on things and just make notes about where they're looking for rules and stuff like that. I think that's really a healthy practice and something I want to see a lot more of.
I think blind playtesting is really important, but I don't think you can do it remotely. I think you actually have to do it like that with your designer sitting on their hands, like trying to take notes on what they're getting wrong and going a little crazy.
Right. I think that's definitely the better way to do
it. For me, I definitely don't have publishers asking me to playtest for them. I know a few people that playtest for Z-Man games. It's generally people that are multilingual, especially people that speak French or German. They'll get to playtest for specific publishers a lot. For me, it's more like the people that ask me to playtest are either very familiar with what I enjoy and try and find things that I might like that I can help with, or just randos that have seen my name on somewhere. But as far as the type of playtesting I'm willing to do, if it's in person, I like to give feedback as we go. If it's a short game, just kind of like what we talked about earlier. And if it's a longer game, it better be balance issues. I'm really hoping not to just I don't want to be your first playtest. That's not where I like being, and it's not what I enjoy. For playtests that I do remotely, like if someone sends me a copy of something, or the Game Crafter or something prototypes, I generally play it a few times with friends of mine and then do a feedback video. It's easier for me to get my thoughts out if I just take some notes and then I do just a video and I go through rules and I go through balance and I go through cards or whatever, and I can hold them up to camera. I found it to be super helpful. It's super shareable, so if someone's working with other designers or developers, they can just watch it, absorb it, and then send it to their others, rather than trying to reinterpret something I've said to them over a live chat. I found video to be what I like to do best. If they sent me a feedback form, I guess I would be able to fill that out, but I've never had anyone do that with specific questions or anything. I think that would take a different personality than designers usually have.
Yeah, the only thing I know that's like that is Unpub, but their feedback form is geared more towards very general questions about whether or not this game is enjoyable, and I think it's more geared towards is this the final form of the game or not, which is always an important question to ask.
Well, and I think Playtest Northwest has those types of forums, which is like the big playtest group around here. So you see them at a lot of events, a lot of stores. But I've actually told them several times that the form that they have is very, I don't want to be offensive, but it's like public facing form. It's not for people who are super into games. It's not for developers or playtesters. It's very much like, hi, person off the street, what did you think of your experience playing this game? Did your kids like it? It doesn't get in depth with any specific questions. It's very generic, and I found it to be less helpful for me because I just want to flip the page over and write on the back. So I generally do.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of those forms. Personally filling them out, at least. I think they could be a useful tool. Yeah, my favorite way to playtest is definitely in person, and preferably with some guidance about what the designer is currently looking for feedback on. I'll make other comments too, of course, if there's something poking me in the eye or whatever. But if I know that I'm supposed to be looking at balance of the cards, that's very useful for me to be able to focus on just the cards.
Totally. I really love when they know what they want feedback on.
Right. It's always hardest when I don't know what they're trying to do, or they're just like, I want feedback, period. And particularly in early stages, sometimes that's the right thing. But even in early stages, it's helpful to know that like they think of it as being in the early stages and they want feedback right now and just like general concept. And the balance is going to be off in the cards or whatever, and that's fine. And that way I'm not wasting my time telling them about like, oh, I think this power cost needs to be increased or this ability needs to be tweaked or whatever. I can just tell them about like this is coming together as an engaging game. And I tend to also give a lot of feedback in writing. So even when I do feedback in person, I'll often follow that up with a long email because I tend to think about games a lot after I play them. But whether or not I'll actually bother writing that depends on whether I think the person will actually read it. Preferably, I've just discussed it with them beforehand. Sometimes I know the person, and that makes it worthwhile. But
and that gets into a good point. So a couple pitfalls that I've come across while playtesting, because people are very into their game. Like, people have been designing this game. This is their baby. They've been working on it for a long time. There's sometimes a lot of pushback when you're trying to give just feedback to someone. If you're a designer and you want feedback, the most frustrating thing on earth to me, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but the most frustrating thing on earth, I have issue with X in your game. Your game, this card is too powerful, this action is undervalued, like there's no reason I would ever take this action, like it's strictly worse than this one. They try and explain, like literally it becomes, I hear what you're saying, this is the reason it's like that. They give you this weird excuse of why they decided to choose that thing or do that way or whatever. And as feedback, that's great. If you want to give me feedback on my feedback, I guess that's okay. But for me to give you feedback on your game and you just tell me why it's going to stay exactly the same is very frustrating. Even if you're never going to incorporate anything I've said to you, the last thing I want to hear is why you're keeping or retaining the parts of it I didn't care for. Like, if I don't like it, that's okay. Maybe your game isn't for me. But to have to hear the reasons why it became that way it's frustrating and weird to me. And it happens a lot. People are very willing to tell you why it has to be that way and why it became that way because they made this decision this one time, this other person said this thing, and you just don't care.
Yeah, I think I try to, when I'm working with someone, I try to break my feedback into roughly two categories. One is like, what am I experiencing? And that is not up for debate whatsoever. Like, if I'm not having fun, you're not going to convince me that I was. Or if I feel that this card is underpowered, then maybe afterwards we can discuss about why you think it's balanced overall and I'm like overlooking something. But at the start, I'm just telling you how I feel about the game or what I currently perceive. And that's feedback that I think, well, if people are making suggestions at that stage, then it's a thing where you need to listen for what they're trying to address. Like, maybe they think cards need to be more expensive because there's too much money or whatever resource in the game. And what you actually need to do is reduce the quantities of that resource rather than changing anything about the cards and stuff like that. So after we've discussed the sort of what happened during the playtest from the perspective of the players, then I'm willing to have discussions about the actual design of the game and why things should or should not be a particular way. But I totally agree that arguing with people, for lack of a better word, and that's a lot of time what it feels like, particularly for the playtester, is that it's like I'm trying to help you and tell you how I felt about the game, and you're just telling me about why I'm wrong. And that's not helpful. I think it's really important that people feel like their feedback is valued. And when I've done some public playtesting of a game I was working on with the designer, and I tried to always take it as like, okay, what did you think about the game? And just tell me. Like, I'm just listening right now and taking notes. That's all I'm here for the moment. And again, like sometimes playtesters do want to stay and discuss why things are the way they are, but I'm not going, or at least I try very hard to not push that onto people.
Right. That's a whole different question. Like, especially when they use words, there are certain words in playtesting that it infuriates me if someone has pushback. If they ask if something is fun and I say no because, that is a subjective thing. I'm trying to tell you that for me, in my personal experience, I did not have fun with blah. And when they tell me, oh, well, we did that because blah, 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 I'm like, okay, so you made a conscious decision to make me not have fun. You know, they use these subjective terms over and over that you really want to help them with, because especially fun factor should go into a game. Like maybe 18xx is actually fun for some people, and I think a lot of people playtesting a game like that would be like, oh, no, this isn't fun. This is a spreadsheet. I don't like it. But if you told that to the designer and they said, well, we did that because brr, 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 you're not gauging your audience well, you're not understanding who your game is for anymore. And you mentioned that at the very beginning, and I think that's super valid. I have a little trouble. People ask you to playtest games a lot, and if the game is super light, I'm always going to start saying, I really wish I could change the play order, or I wish I could have done this or that. And I have to tell people, I'm like, I understand that I'm adding things to your game that you probably don't want. I understand that your game is maybe supposed to be fun and thought-free, and everything I'm saying is probably not super helpful. So I may not be the audience for you, but they have a hard time picking that audience before they get to playtesting.
Right. And sometimes that's okay. Like sometimes it's just like, I'm trying to figure out if anyone at all likes this. And that's like a perfectly valid thing to listen for. Like if you're playtesting something and you think it will be fun for some audience, but you can't find anyone who actually finds it fun, then that seems like a problem. You've also reminded me of what I think was one of my roughest playtest sessions, like as a playtester, or where I'm most aware that I did a bad job, which was I playtested Gilhova's Bad Medicine, which is generally like not a game I should playtest because I'm just not into those sorts of party game things. And that's fine. But we also playtested it right after we played like a 3-hour long strategy game. And so afterwards I was like, I really wish that like the parts of the words on the cards were arranged in a way that made it harder to form words out of them and stuff like that. Which is not at all what that game needs. It's not Scrabble with cards and a pitch. It's it's primarily focused on the pitching part and providing fodder for that, right?
Right. I mean, asking you to play test a party game like Bad Medicine is a very light game. Sorry, Gil. But I would never ask you to play test that game.
It's fine. Like I think before that I play tested the networks like once or something. We didn't really know each other. These things happen. And it was asking about like, do I tell people whether I find a game fun? And I say that I'm bad about providing feedback about fun, and part of that is because I hate the word fun. It's such an excuse when it comes to designing games in my mind, because what fun is a proxy for like what is entertaining and engaging about that game.
It becomes like the word strategy game. I hate that. It's so loaded. Like, what do you mean by strategy? But
right.
Fun is a horrible thing.
Yeah. So I could tell you about whether or not, like, I try to focus on things that I can point at more. And to the extent that I do fuzzy stuff, it's things like I felt like I couldn't plan ahead. And sometimes that's because like I just don't know the game, and so I don't know like how I should be thinking about the future. And sometimes it's just because it's impossible to plan because, dice or cards or some earth-shattering move occurs or whatever. And one of the things I most want when I work with people is knowing what they're aiming for in terms of experience. Like if you want this to be a game where people plan ahead and like carefully position themselves, or do you want it to be more like, and wacky stuff occurs? I'm making extremes here, of course, but there are a lot of different ways to look at this. It's just that's the easiest one to say.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to literally a few questions before a playtest. Like, where is your game at? What kind of feedback are you looking for? Who and what kind of feedback do you want? How do you want that feedback? And what form did the game take? And I think once you answer a lot of that, you're going to have a much more comfortable, successful session than just showing up with your prototype at a thing and like hoping for the best. The other thing I will say about feedback and playtesting in general, it's easier to do at conventions because there are just more people and more opportunities. But conventions can be some of the worst experiences for playtesting I've ever had. Everyone's sleep deprived. Everyone is malnourished. There's tons of things going on around you and lots of distractions and usually really tight schedules. And so playtesting at a convention can be kind of the antithesis of what you want to provide for your playtesters, is like a comfortable environment where they feel like creatively open and like stress-free to really focus on your game. And I think conventions take a lot of that away. I know that it's important to use conventions because of the proximity of people and kind of unusual situation you have, but I've had much more fun playtesting with smaller groups, one-on-one, outside of that type of environment. But I don't see that in more than just Seattle and New York. Like there are certain areas, but I don't see it everywhere.
I think in general you want to have your game play tested, particularly through the different stages of its development by different groups of people. And conventions are very helpful for finding people who are not your friends and are not your friends of friends, stuff like that. But I agree that the environment is generally not the best otherwise. Like if you can get to some place where there are people who get together and play games and they're willing to play test a game, which is always a big if. Like if you can go to like a meetup on the other side of town that you never go to, and there's some folks there who are willing to play test your game, definitely go and take advantage of that. And I think it's also helpful to find people who haven't been playtesting your game so far, because it's very easy to like have a group of however many people who are willing to try your game, and so they've seen it like through its different iterations. But because of that, their perspective is a little warped on how the game, because they're looking at both the past and present game, right?
Right, and groupthink happens too. You get people that think that, you know, X or Y will always win, and this is the best strategy, and they tend to not look outside that too well. People don't have a great perspective for that. I think having a playtest group is fantastic to get a game to a certain point, but it's never going to get best or better after that.
Right.
Well, awesome. We're going to cut it a little bit short today. I am going to go do an escape room a little later, and my brain is fried, so I'm going to go get food first.
Food is good. Escaping is also good.
Well, we're going to hope to get out of the room. It'll be good. I really appreciate you coming on. I was happy with this topic. I thought it was an interesting one, and then when you were free to chat, it was a really good mix. You've done a lot of really cool playtesting, I think.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for everyone in the chat, and I will see you. I will try and do some vlogging later this week. I've been a little out of it, but I'll try and get back to y'all soon. Bye.
Bye.
Click the button.